A low, sharp cry cut through the boarding area, the kind that freezes everyone for a split second. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to stop touching my husband." The voice trembled, but held a fire beneath it. Heads turned. A frail man in his late 70s stood half-bent over his cane, while a younger gate agent blocked his path with an extended arm. The fluorescent lights above flickered, as if unsettled by the tension. Wind rattled the terminal windows. People held their breath. And somewhere beyond the murmurs and shuffling feet, Benjamin Carter watched from a distance, eyes narrowed, pulse steady. He had seen humiliation before. But this was the kind that seeped into your bones. Benjamin stepped forward, his movements measured like a man walking toward a truth he had long expected. The couple had arrived early for the evening flight from Dallas to Boston, hoping to settle into their seats before the rush. The husband, Walter Pierce, a retired firefighter with hands still scarred from a blaze decades earlier, tried to maintain dignity as he insisted he was in the right boarding group. His wife, Eleanor, leaned into him, her fingers gripping his sleeve with a tremor of embarrassment and worry. The gate agent's expression hardened with the stubborn certainty of someone convinced they were correcting a rule breaker. Walter repeated softly that his ticket showed priority access, but the agent wouldn't look down at the paper in his shaking hand. Benjamin watched the way Walter's shoulders curled inward, the way Eleanor's breath hitched at the gate agent's raised voice. The moment stretched thin and brittle. Something about it felt too familiar, too practiced, as though this wasn't the first time the agent had chosen the wrong person to challenge. Benjamin had spent more than 3 decades in the aviation world, quietly maneuvering behind the scenes of deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. But he had never grown numb to this particular kind of dismissal. It hit deeper than policy or protocol. It hit the soul. He stepped closer, pretending to adjust his boarding pass. His eyes flicked briefly to the couple. Walter's face held the calm of a man who had seen real danger, flames licking at his helmet, smoke clawing at his throat, yet somehow survived. Now he stood here, disrespected, by someone who didn't know a single chapter of his life. Eleanor's voice cracked as she pleaded for the agent to check the computer system again. The agent waved her off, saying the line had to move. Benjamin's jaw tightened. Not yet, he told himself. Timing mattered, and this wasn't his moment to intervene. He wanted to see one thing first: who would step up without being asked. A young flight attendant approached, her brow creased. Her name tag read, Monica. She leaned toward the agent, whispering, motioning toward the couple's tickets. The agent's response was a curt shake of the head. Walter stood straighter, summoning a dignity the years hadn't taken from him. "I served this country for 35 years, he said evenly. "All I'm asking is to be treated fairly." The gate agent scoffed, muttered something about people trying to game the system, and reached for his radio. A hush fell. Benjamin felt a cold thread coil beneath his ribs. Eleanor stepped protectively in front of her husband's eyes, shining with both fury and fear. Monica tried again, louder this time, urging the agent to double-check the manifest. The radio crackled. Security was being called. That was when Benjamin moved. He approached slowly, voice steady, respectful, but carrying weight like steel under velvet. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. The gate agent turned annoyed already, forming a reply, but the words stalled when they met Benjamin's expression. It wasn't anger. It was authority, wrapped in quiet restraint, the kind that made people correct their posture without knowing why. "This gentleman is not authorized to board," yet the agent snapped but softer now. Benjamin glanced at the ticket in Walter's trembling hand. He read it once, twice. Then he lifted his gaze to the agent with a calm that felt more dangerous than shouting. "The ticket says priority access," Benjamin said simply. A ripple moved through the bystanders. Monica exhaled in relief. Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly, hope flickering. The gate agent stiffened and typed furiously into the computer, jaw clenched. A few seconds later, the screen flashed green. Priority access confirmed. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude passing over him. The agent muttered a forced apology, but the damage was already carved deep. Eleanor placed a hand on her husband's arm, whispering that they could finally board. Walter nodded, offering Benjamin a quiet thank you. His voice was raspy, worn from years of smoke and age, but sincere. Benjamin stepped aside as they walked down the jet bridge, watching the two silhouettes merge into the soft glow of the cabin lights ahead. He noticed the way Eleanor wiped a tear before she thought anyone could see. He noticed the way Walter steadied her hand, without looking at her, an old couple's silent language. Then he noticed something else, Monica, the junior attendant, lingering with an unsettled expression. She wasn't looking at Benjamin. She was looking at the gate agent, studying him, as though replaying every moment of the confrontation. Something unspoken passed through her eyes, something like recognition or suspicion. Benjamin held her gaze for a brief moment. It lasted only a heartbeat, but in that heartbeat he sensed a shift in the air, a subtle tilt in the story unfolding around them. Monica wasn't just troubled. She was afraid of something, not of the agent, not of the scene that had unfolded, but of what she knew would come next. Benjamin boarded the aircraft with the same quiet composure he always carried, but inside him the tension coiled tighter. He could feel fault lines beneath the calm surface of this flight. Lines that only needed a small pressure to break open. And break open they would. Because one thing lingered in his mind, a question that felt less like curiosity and more like a warning. Why had the gate agent been so certain, so absolutely certain, that the system wasn't wrong? The cabin lights glowed with a dim amber warmth as Benjamin stepped inside, but the atmosphere carried an invisible tension, like a room that had just witnessed an argument no one wanted to talk about. Passengers settled into their seats, with the stiff, uneasy movements of people trying to pretend nothing had happened at the gate. The hum of the ventilation system mixed with hushed whispers, brief glances, and the unmistakable quiet that follows public humiliation. Benjamin walked down the aisle at an unhurried pace, reading the space the way some people read weather. A low-pressure system of discomfort lingered here. Walter and Eleanor had already taken their seats near the front of premium economy, Eleanor adjusting his blanket, Walter trying to make himself appear smaller than he was. Benjamin noted the way the older man pressed his fingertips into his knee, an old habit of grounding himself. Someone who had learned long ago to take pain in silence. Benjamin gave him a small nod, acknowledgement, not pity. Walter returned it with a faint smile. A few rows back, a man in his 30s wearing a charcoal sport coat pretended to scroll his phone, but his eyes flicked repeatedly toward Walter. Something about the way he watched, quiet, assessing, calculated, pulled at Benjamin's attention. The man's posture was stiff, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping the screen in a rhythm that didn't match any real typing, a nervous tell or something else. When he sensed Benjamin looking, he instantly lowered his gaze, too fast, too practiced. Benjamin filed it away. He slid into his own seat by the window. The leather creaked softly beneath him. Outside, the last rays of dusk painted streaks of violet across the sky. He had sent a message earlier to his Boston contact, confirming the meeting time. There was still enough room in the evening to rest for a few hours before diving into negotiation briefs. Yet his focus refused to shift away from the gate incident. Not because of the disrespect. That part he was too used to, but because it had felt rehearsed. The agent's insistence, the hesitance of the junior attendant, the watchful stranger in the cabin. There were patterns there, and patterns always meant something. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a short delay due to paperwork. A few groans filled the cabin. Eleanor rubbed Walter's shoulder as he sank deeper into his seat, exhausted. The man in the sport coat closed his eyes as though willing himself invisible. Then Monica appeared again. Her smile was polite, but thin, stretched over something unsettled. She walked down the aisle, offering a quiet greeting to each passenger. When she reached Benjamin, she paused, as if debating whether to speak. "Let me know if you need anything before we take off," she said. Her voice was gentle but carried a weight beneath it. "Thank you," Benjamin replied. She hesitated. "And thank you for earlier. Most people don't step in." "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said, though her gratitude stirred something in him. "Just pointed out what was already true." Her eyes softened, but her worry remained. She started to step away, but Benjamin lowered his voice just enough. "Is there something I should know about tonight's flight?" Her breath caught barely perceptible. Fear flickered in her eyes, the kind a person carries when they've witnessed something they can't prove but can't forget. She blinked and straightened. "No, sir. Everything's fine." Which meant everything was not fine. She continued down the aisle. The cabin door closed with a heavy thud moments later, the kind that always struck Benjamin like a symbolic lock. Once that door shut, whatever happened on the flight stayed inside until landing. The aircraft pushed back from the gate engines, rumbling beneath the floor. Wind hissed across the fuselage as darkness thickened outside. Benjamin rested his head against the seat, but just as he exhaled, a metallic clatter echoed from the forward galley. A tray falling, a cart shifting, Monica's voice whispering sharply to someone. Then a deeper, unfamiliar male voice cut through terse and frustrated. Benjamin lifted his head. That wasn't typical crew banter. He strained to listen, but the sounds vanished, swallowed by engine roar as the plane began taxiing. The man in the sport coat opened his eyes instantly, as though trained to react to certain noises. His gaze darted toward the galley, and something cold flickered across his features before he masked it, behind an indifferent expression. Benjamin's instincts sharpened. As the plane lifted into the night sky, the cabin vibrated gently. People settled in. Eleanor leaned her head on Walter's shoulder. The man in the sport coat finally relaxed his posture, though only slightly. Benjamin waited until the seatbelt sign turned off, before rising to stretch. He walked slowly toward the galley. Monica was alone now, her hands gripping the metal counter as though bracing herself. When she heard footsteps, she straightened quickly. "Everything all right?" Benjamin asked. "Yes," she said, too quickly. "Just a hectic day." Her eyes darted not to him, but toward a compartment behind her, one slightly ajar. Benjamin caught the faintest glimpse of something inside a folder, read its corner marked with a slanted white stripe. He'd seen folders like that before. Airlines used them internally, but the red-striped ones were different. Special handling, restricted information. Monica saw his line of sight and closed the compartment firmly. "Passengers aren't allowed forward right now," she said, more tense than firm. Benjamin nodded and stepped back, giving her space. Of course. But as he turned, he heard a whisper behind him. Not to him, but from the compartment. A mechanical crackle like a tiny radio, words barely audible. "Monitor before landing." Benjamin froze. The cabin noise muffled the rest. Monitor who? He glanced back, but Monica's expression was the picture of polite dismissal, or fear. Returning to his seat, Benjamin studied the cabin again. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing looked wrong. And yet the air felt colder, tighter, as though the flight itself held its breath. The man in the sport coat watched him again, this time without pretending. Their eyes met for a long beat. Neither looked away. Then the man offered a slow, almost cordial nod. Not friendly, acknowledging, recognizing. Benjamin sat back, pulse steady, but higher than before. He closed his eyes and inhaled, letting the vibration of the engines ground him. In 40 years he had learned to read a room, read a company, read people. And every instinct in him said this flight, quiet, ordinary, unremarkable on the surface, was about to pivot. A small detail, a wrong voice in the galley, a frightened attendant, a strange passenger, an agent too eager to assert control. Pieces rarely came together by accident. Somebody on this plane wasn't supposed to be here, and someone else knew it. Under the pale glow of the seatbelt lights, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that feels less like calm and more like a held breath. Benjamin kept his eyes half closed, listening not to rest but to measure the rhythm of the aircraft, the cadence of footsteps, the tone of voices drifting through the aisle. Years in aviation had taught him that danger rarely announced itself. It folded into the ordinary, disguising itself in routine movements and familiar sounds. But tonight, nothing felt routine. The man in the sport coat, row 7, shifted again. Not the subtle stretch of a restless traveler, but a repositioning move, like someone adjusting for visibility. His gaze flickered toward the front of the plane, then toward Walter and Eleanor, lingering just long enough to mean something. Benjamin watched him in the reflection of his window. People reveal more when they don't think they're being watched. He opened the in-seat menu, not to read it, but to mask the movement of his eyes. Row 7 man wasn't looking at him anymore. He was watching the aisle, and specifically watching Monica. She appeared a moment later, pushing the beverage cart with a careful, almost cautious pace. Her smile seemed softer now, but that tension, thin as tracing paper, stretched across a flame, still lived behind her eyes. When she reached Benjamin's row, she hesitated, as if standing in the wake of something approaching. "Water, please," Benjamin said. She handed him the cup with steady hands, but her voice dropped to a whisper, so faint only he could hear it. "Stay alert." He held the cup suspended in air. She didn't look at him, didn't pause. She just continued down the aisle as though nothing had been said. Benjamin felt the shift immediately, a tightening, a narrowing. Someone somewhere on this aircraft was engaged in something she feared, and fear doesn't emerge without a reason. Ahead of him, Walter attempted to stand, to stretch his legs. His cane slipped slightly, and he grabbed the armrest. Eleanor caught him just in time, her grip firm despite her small hands. A passenger nearby, a heavy-set man with a worn denim jacket, rose abruptly to help. But before he could reach them, Row 7 man shot up and placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "You're all right," he said too forcefully, guiding Walter back down. "You shouldn't be walking around yet." Benjamin straightened. The tone was wrong, too controlling, too possessive for a stranger. Eleanor bristled. "He just needs to stretch his knees. Please let go." Row 7 man released Walter, but didn't step back immediately. His jaw flexed. His eyes darted toward the galley again before he finally retreated to his row. The denim jacket man watched him with mild confusion. That was odd. Benjamin nodded quietly, his mind already working. Row 7 man wasn't concerned for Walter's safety. No. His reaction held something closer to caution, like he wasn't worried about the old man collapsing, but about him moving. Benjamin felt the engines hum under his feet, steady, but lower pitched than usual. It was a normal sound, but his awareness sharpened, as though the entire aircraft had suddenly dropped 2 degrees. He knew patterns, and he knew when patterns didn't fit. The drink service continued. Monica avoided looking toward Row 7 man, entirely as if eye contact alone might ignite trouble. Another flight attendant, a taller man named David, worked beside her. His expression was neutral, but overstretched the mask of someone who'd been told not to ask too many questions. David reached Eleanor's row. "Can I get you anything this evening?" Eleanor requested tea. Her voice still rattled. Walter asked for coffee. David nodded courteously, but when he leaned in to place the cups on their tray table, Benjamin saw it. A flicker of recognition. David's eyes shifted toward Walter, not with suspicion, but with the kind of quiet calculation people make when comparing a face to a memory. Walter thanked him and smiled unaware, but David's throat bobbed. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled back the tray. Something clicked in Benjamin's mind. The gate agent's hostility, the red folder in the galley, the whispered warning, the stranger watching Walter like he was waiting for something, and now a flight attendant who recognized him. The pressure in the cabin thickened. Benjamin stood slow and deliberate, using the pretense of stretching his legs. He walked toward the back of the plane. Each step felt heavier, as though the gravity inside the aircraft had shifted. When he reached the rear galley, he found David alone, rinsing cups, shoulders hunched like someone fighting an internal war. Benjamin didn't waste time. "You recognize the man in row 3, he said quietly. "Walter Pierce." David froze, water streaming into the sink. He didn't look up. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do." A long, tense moment passed. Then David exhaled, defeated, lowering his voice to a trembling whisper. "It was in the news," David said. "Months ago. A wrongful arrest. A case dismissed because the department mishandled evidence. They blamed him for something that wasn't his fault." Benjamin's pulse quickened. "So why does that matter now?" David swallowed hard. "Because someone reopened the case. Not officially. Quietly. Off the record." He paused, glancing toward the forward cabin. "And that man in row 7. He's not a regular passenger. I saw him talking to the gate agent before boarding. They weren't discussing seating." Benjamin leaned closer. "What were they discussing?" David's voice cracked. He showed the agent a photo, a man to watch for. And it was Walter. The cold that spread through Benjamin wasn't shock, it was recognition, a truth forming. "This isn't random," Benjamin said. "No," David whispered. "Someone wants that man monitored, maybe detained, and it's not coming through proper channels." Benjamin straightened breath, steadying decisions forming as quickly as questions. If someone was using this flight to extract Walter quietly, It meant they didn't want oversight, didn't want paperwork, didn't want resistance, and that made the danger real. He looked toward the dim cabin where Walter sat, unaware Eleanor smoothing the fabric on his sleeve with the gentle devotion of someone who had loved him through decades of storms. Whatever story was unfolding here, whatever forces had converged on this single ordinary flight, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had chosen the wrong plane, and the wrong night, because Benjamin Carter was on board. Benjamin felt the aircraft shift ever so slightly, the faint kind of bump that most passengers would mistake for turbulence. But he knew better. This wasn't turbulence. It was someone moving through the cabin with purpose, someone heading toward Walter. He left the galley and walked back up the aisle, controlled, steady his mind, slicing through possibilities with cold precision. The man in the sport coat, row 7, was leaning out of his seat now, his elbows braced on his knees, watching Walter with the predatory patience of a hunter, waiting for his cue. He didn't blink when Benjamin passed him, didn't flinch, just tracked him, eyes dark and deliberate. Benjamin returned to his seat, just as Eleanor adjusted Walter's blanket again. Her hands moved with the kind of tenderness that only years of shared battles could forge. Walter murmured something to her, his voice soft, hopeful, tired. Benjamin caught the words. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe tonight will be a quiet flight. A quiet flight. Benjamin wished he believed that, but the sense of wrongness pressed against his ribs like a tightening band. 2 seats behind them, row 7 man unbuckled his belt. The quiet click cut through the cabin's low hum. Benjamin's muscles tensed. The man stood, not abruptly, but with a practiced ease that said he didn't want to be noticed. He began walking toward the front cabin, near the lavatory, but his eyes flicked toward Walter as he passed. A silent measure. An inventory. Then he reached the curtain that separated premium economy from first class, paused and slipped through. Benjamin watched the curtain fall behind him. A small detail, but wrong. Passengers weren't allowed past cabin class divisions without a reason. Not during flight, not without a crew member escort, unless they'd been given permission, or unless they didn't need permission. The plane seemed to grow quieter. Monica appeared again, but this time her steps were unsteady. She knelt slightly beside Walter, offering him another blanket, but her focus kept darting toward the forward cabin. As she stood, Benjamin touched her forearm lightly, just enough pressure to ask without words. She inhaled sharply. "He shouldn't be up there," she whispered. "Row 7, Benjamin asked. She nodded. He said the captain wanted to see him, but the captain didn't call for anyone. I checked. Benjamin felt the temperature inside him drop a few degrees. "Did you confront him?" "No," she said. He flashed something. A badge, I couldn't see it clearly. But he said he was on assignment, and that I should stay in my lane. A badge? Or something that looked enough like one to intimidate a junior attendant into silence. Benjamin lowered his voice further. "Is anyone else on the crew acting strange?" Monica nodded. David's scared. I'm scared. We weren't briefed about any special passenger. No law enforcement. No transportation officer. Nothing. "Which means someone is operating unofficially," Benjamin said. Before his mind could finish the thought, the forward curtain rustled again. Row 7 man reappeared. His walk had changed, more confident now, as though whatever he'd done in first class had reinforced his plan. He didn't return to his seat immediately. Instead, he paused by row 3, staring at Walter again, studying him openly, evaluating. Benjamin leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on the man's face. Row 7 man noticed, gave a faint, almost amused smirk, then slowly returned to his seat. This time he didn't buckle in. Benjamin's heartbeat steadied itself. Not speeding, focusing, preparing. The intercom chimed suddenly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're expecting smooth skies for the remainder of the flight. Sit back. Relax." But the captain's voice faltered just briefly. Not enough for most passengers to catch it. Enough for Benjamin. That wasn't the same tone the captain had used during takeoff. There was a tension under it. Something forced. Something watched. Monica approached again, hands clasped together to hide their trembling. "The captain didn't make that announcement," she whispered. "That wasn't his voice." Benjamin stared at her. "You're sure I've flown with him 3 years? I know his voice." That wasn't him. Benjamin felt the world tilt just a fraction, but enough. Enough to understand that this flight had already crossed from unusual into dangerous. He rose from his seat. Sir Monica said, panic in her throat, "Please don't confront him. Not now. Let me talk to the senior crew first." But Benjamin wasn't heading toward row 7. Not yet. He walked instead to Walter and Eleanor. The older couple looked up at him with confusion threaded through their concern. "Are you feeling all right?" Benjamin asked Walter casually, but with intent beneath the words. Walter nodded slowly. "Just tired." "It's been a day. Did anyone approach you before boarding?" Benjamin asked, voice low. Walter exchanged a brief look with Eleanor. "There was a man," Eleanor said quietly. "At the security checkpoint. He kept staring at Walter. Followed us for a bit. But when I asked if something was wrong, he backed off." Benjamin's chest tightened. "What did he look like?" he asked. Eleanor's fingers curled around her husband's wrist. Dark hair, clean-shaven, sport coat, row 7. Benjamin breathed in once through his nose, slow and steady, letting the realization sink into place. Then he said something that made Eleanor's face pale. "He's not here to monitor you, Walter. He's here to take you." Walter blinked, stunned. "Why I didn't do anything?" "I know," Benjamin said softly. He braced himself, leaning closer. "And I believe someone on this aircraft knows the truth. Someone who didn't go through official channels." Walter swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" Benjamin straightened, scanning the cabin. "Now," he said, "we stop pretending this is a normal flight." He stepped into the aisle, a man walking into a storm he'd felt coming for miles. The hum of the engines deepened. The lights overhead flickered. The curtain toward first class stirred again. Somewhere ahead, the truth waited in the dark. And Benjamin Carter was done waiting for it to come to him. The aisle felt narrower as Benjamin moved forward, every step sinking with the quiet roar of the engines. Outside, the night sky pressed against the windows, black, heavy, endless, while inside the cabin, tension clung to the air like humidity before a storm. Passengers murmured their conversations, drifting between clipped curiosity and fragile composure. No one knew what was happening. Benjamin suspected most wouldn't believe it, even if they were told. He paused halfway up the aisle, steadying himself as row 7 man rose again. Their eyes locked, and this time the man didn't bother hiding the calculation in his gaze. He stepped into the aisle, blocking Benjamin's path. His frame was compact but powerful, the kind of build formed by years of training rather than vanity. His voice was low, cold. "Can I help you with something?" Sir Benjamin answered with a calm that felt like steel cooled in ice. "I think we both know the answer to that." A single beat passed. The man's eyebrow lifted, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're wandering into the wrong section of the plane. And you're wandering into business that clearly isn't yours," Benjamin replied. The man leaned in just enough that only Benjamin could hear him. "Walk away. This doesn't involve you." Benjamin held the man's gaze unblinking. "When you threaten an old man and frighten the crew, it involves everyone." The smile vanished. The man straightened, body tensing like a wire pulled too tight. But before he could respond, the aircraft jolted slightly, a shift, not turbulence, more like a sudden change in pitch. Passengers looked up unsettled. Benjamin turned his head just enough to glance toward the forward galley. Something was happening up front. The man in the sport coat noticed it too. His eyes flicked toward the curtain. His nostrils flared. Something had gone off plan. He backed away. "Go sit down," he muttered. "Now." Benjamin didn't move. "Not yet." Then Monica's voice rang out louder than before, edged with panic. "Sir, please return to your seats." She wasn't looking at Benjamin. She was looking past him toward the cockpit door. Benjamin followed her gaze. The cockpit door, normally sealed and dead-bolted in flight, was not fully shut. It hung slightly ajar, the latch, misaligned just enough to reveal a sliver of light and movement inside. Benjamin's pulse sharpened. The pilots weren't visible. Instead, a shadow moved across the brightness, slow, deliberate. Someone was inside. Someone who shouldn't be. Benjamin turned, fully stepping forward, but Row 7 man reacted instantly, clamping a hand around Benjamin's forearm in a grip that would have staggered someone less controlled. "Sit down," the man growled. "Final warning." Benjamin didn't flinch. "If you're not law enforcement, you're committing a federal offense by standing here. And if you are, you'd better have orders. Real ones." Row 7 man's grip tightened. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He didn't answer, which meant he wasn't official. Benjamin shifted his weight, just slightly preparing for the possibility of force when a sudden sharp cry erupted from the front of the plane. "Stop, please don't touch him." It was a woman's voice, not Monica's, not a flight attendant. Benjamin recognized it. Eleanor. He broke free, pushing past Row 7 man with surprising force for someone his age. Shock flashed across the younger man's face, but he recovered quickly, lunging after Benjamin. Passengers gasped as the two men collided, Benjamin bracing himself against a seat to keep from falling. Sir, take your seats immediately," Monica cried, running toward the commotion. Row 7 man grabbed Benjamin's shoulder again, but not to stop him. This time it was different. A flicker of alarm crossed his face, as though something behind Benjamin startled him. Benjamin spun. Walter Pierce, frail, stoic Walter, was standing in the aisle. No cane. Shoulders squared, Eleanor held onto him with both hands, pleading, but he stood tall as a man, carrying the weight of something long borrowed, and in his hand was a small black wallet. He held it toward Benjamin. No, not toward Benjamin. Toward Row 7 man. Inside the wallet was an identification card. Federal. But not the kind Row 7 man had flashed earlier. Benjamin never expected this. Walter Pierce was not just a retired firefighter. He was a retired federal whistleblower, a man who had exposed a covert operation decades earlier, an operation that had cost powerful people money, careers, reputations, a man who had been targeted before, a man they thought had disappeared into obscurity, but someone had found him again. Row 7 man froze. His bloodless stare flicked from Walter to the ID and back again, realization rippling through him. "You," he whispered. "You're alive." Walter's voice came out steady, decades of quiet strength pouring through it. I was never supposed to die for your mistakes. For a moment, everything held still. The hum of the engines, the breath of the passengers. Even row 7 man's heartbeat seemed suspended in air. Then Benjamin saw it. Not in Walter, not in the attacker. In Eleanor. Fear. Deep. Old. Worn into her bones. She had lived this secret with her husband for years, protecting him, waiting for the day it might resurface. Benjamin stepped between Walter and row 7 man, raising a hand not to strike but to shield. His voice dropped to a tone that cut through the entire cabin. This flight is done being your hunting ground. Passengers began standing. David emerged from the rear galley. Monica lifted her chin with a mix of fear and defiance. Something powerful shifted in the cabin, something no badge or threat could command. For the first time, row 7 man looked uncertain. Not defeated, but outnumbered. He stepped back, breathing hard, mind calculating his next move. Benjamin felt the moment teeter on a knife's edge. Then the aircraft lurched again, much harder this time. Lights flickered. A warning tone blared. Someone inside the cockpit shouted. And in that split second, Benjamin understood. The danger hadn't just come on board. It had reached the flight deck. And whatever awaited behind that cracked open door was far worse than the man standing in the aisle. The aircraft banked slightly, just enough for every passenger to feel the wrongness of it. A ripple of dread moved through the cabin. Not panic yet, just the kind of collective inhale people take when they sense something is off but don't know why. Benjamin steadied himself against the seat back as the lights flickered again, casting sharp shadows across faces now drained of color. Row 7 man turned toward the cockpit, eyes narrowing. For the first time, he looked rattled. Whatever he'd come here to do, whatever script he'd been following, something inside that flight deck had broken the plan. He took a step forward, but Benjamin blocked him, the tension between them tightening like a wire pulled to the point of snapping. Before either man could speak, the cockpit door creaked wider. Just an inch. Just enough for the cabin to see a fractured glimpse of movement inside. A figure leaned heavily against the console. Another stood behind him. There was a struggle happening, quiet, contained, but undeniable. Eleanor gasped. Walter reached instinctively for her hand. Monica clapped both of hers over her mouth, as if trying to hold in a scream. Then a voice, strained, breathless, escaped the narrow gap in the door. "Help, he's not supposed to be in here." The sentence cut off with a choked sound. Benjamin reacted first. He pushed past row 7 man, grabbing the overhead compartment for leverage as he moved toward the cockpit. Monica ran after him, her shoes skidding on the carpet. Row 7 man lunged to intercept, but a surprising force stopped him. Walter. Though his hands shook, Walter gripped the man's sleeve hard enough to halt his momentum. The entire cabin seemed suspended on a single thin thread of courage. Benjamin reached the cockpit door. He pressed his ear to it, one sharp breath too, and heard shuffling something metallic, dropping the low rumble of the captain's voice, struggling to stay calm. Then the unmistakable snap of a latch being forced out of place. Someone inside the cockpit was trying to override the controls. Benjamin slammed his palm against the emergency call button beside the door. The chime rang through the aircraft, shrill, urgent, impossible to ignore. David burst from the aft galley, eyes wide. Captain didn't authorize any entries. Who went in? Row 7 man shouted, "Get away from that door. You don't know what you're doing," but his tone wasn't protective. It was panicked. Benjamin met his eyes for a single cutting second and saw it. Fear. Not fear of Benjamin. Fear of whatever was inside the cockpit. whatever he had thought he controlled and clearly didn't. "You brought this aboard," Benjamin said coldly, "and you lost control of it." A loud thud struck the cockpit door from the inside, hard. Monica staggered back. Eleanor let out a cry. Walter moved protectively in front of her, despite the tremor in his limbs. David rushed forward. "We need to lock the cabin down. Step back, everyone." Row 7 man shook his head. "No, if he gets control of the plane." But he didn't finish. The cockpit door jolted again, opening wider this time, not enough to see everything, but enough for the truth to break into the cabin like a burst of cold air. A man not in uniform was inside the flight deck. He wore civilian clothes. Sweat streaked his face. His arm was locked around the captain's neck, pulling him backward, while the first officer fought to keep the plane steady. Passengers screamed. Not loud, not chaotic, just sharp shocks of terror breaking through years of learned calm. Benjamin grabbed the edge of the door, trying to pull it wider, but the assailant inside kicked it back shut from the other side. The impact knocked Benjamin off balance. He stumbled into the bulkhead, catching himself just before he hit the floor. Monica grabbed his arm. "Don't if they lose control," Benjamin steadied himself. His voice came out low, but clear enough to cut through the rising panic. Someone went in there with intent, and that man in row 7 wasn't here to stop him. Row 7 man's face drained of color. "You have no idea what's at risk." Benjamin stepped towards him. "Then enlighten me." But instead of speaking, row 7 man looked down the aisle toward Walter. Benjamin saw the shift in his eyes before anyone else did. Walter saw it too. He straightened instinctively, gripping the seat back. Eleanor's fingers dug into his wrist. Row 7 man started toward him. Benjamin blocked the path again, this time slamming his forearm into the man's shoulder. The force pushed them both into the aisle wall. Row 7 man shoved back, swift and trained, but Benjamin held firm. The two men struggled, their bodies colliding with armrests, sending cups and blankets tumbling. "Stop it!" Eleanor cried. Benjamin Monica pleaded. The plane lurched again, this time hard enough for overhead bins to rattle. Someone screamed. The engines hummed at a slightly higher pitch, small but significant. Inside the cockpit, the first officer yelled, "Get out! Get out! Now!" Benjamin heard it through the door. He knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was happening in that flight deck was escalating fast. He shoved row 7 man back into his seat, pinning him with a forearm across the chest. "If you know something, say it." Row 7 man didn't answer. Instead, he looked past Benjamin toward the cockpit, with the expression of a man realizing too late that his plan had not simply failed, it had turned on him. "There's more than one," he whispered. The cabin froze. "What do you mean?" Benjamin demanded. But row 7 man's eyes lifted slowly toward the rear of the plane. Benjamin turned. A second man, one no one had noticed, boarding, stood at the back of the aisle. Dark hoodie, steady stride, purposeful steps. He wasn't heading toward the cockpit, he was heading toward Walter. Monica gasped. Eleanor clutched her husband's arm, and Benjamin, still bracing against row 7 man, felt the truth slam into him like a jolt of electricity. This wasn't one coordinated threat. It was two targets, 2 infiltrations, 2 men moving in opposite directions for the same purpose. The first was already compromising the cockpit. The second was coming straight for Walter Pierce. And Benjamin Carter had seconds, only seconds, to decide which danger to confront first. The man in the hoodie moved with a terrifying calm, his footsteps soft but deliberate, the kind of movement that doesn't draw attention until it's too late. The cabin lights flickered again. washing his figure in a pulse of shadow and amber like a warning signal trapped inside a failing bulb. Passengers shrank into their seats. Their eyes followed him, but their bodies froze, locked between instinct and disbelief. Benjamin pushed off row 7 man with a force that surprised them both. He didn't have time to think, only to move. The aisle suddenly felt twice as long, twice as narrow. The hum of the engines deepened an uneasy growl beneath the floor. The man in the hoodie picked up speed, closing the distance to Walter in long, confident strides. Walter stepped in front of Eleanor. His hands trembled, but his spine straightened the way men straighten when they know the inevitable has finally come. Eleanor whispered his name, voice cracking like breaking glass. Benjamin sprinted. He grabbed the nearest headrest and launched himself into the aisle, catching the man in the hoodie by the shoulder. The man twisted sharply, trained, expecting resistance. He didn't fight with panic, he fought with precision. His elbow cut across Benjamin's ribs. Pain shot through Benjamin's side, but he held on, dragging the man sideways into the bulkhead. "Get back!" Benjamin shouted to Walter and Eleanor. The man in the hoodie shifted his weight, aiming a blow at Benjamin's throat. Benjamin ducked, slamming his forearm into the man's wrist. Something metallic clattered to the floor, a thin, cylindrical device that rolled under a seat and stopped just short of row 8. Monica screamed. David grabbed the interphone, calling the cockpit with frantic urgency. But the cockpit was no longer answering. Passengers stood now, several of them, older men with protective instincts overriding fear. The denim jacket man pushed forward, trying to help Benjamin. Another passenger in his 60s reached for the attacker's arm, grabbing hold for just a second before being thrown back. The man in the hoodie broke free and lunged toward Walter. Time fractured. Monica grabbed Eleanor and pulled her toward the opposite aisle. Walter raised his cane, not as a crutch, but as a weapon. Benjamin got one arm around the attacker's neck, dragging him back in a chokehold that compressed every muscle in Benjamin's shoulders. The man slammed Benjamin backward into the lavatory door, knocking the air from his lungs. Benjamin held on, tightening his grip vision, sparking at the edges. Row 7 man stood now watching, calculating with a new expression. Panic. Genuine. He looked toward the cockpit, toward the rear, then toward the rolling metal device under the seat. "Get that," he shouted to no one in particular. "Get it now." David dove for it, sliding between seats like a man diving for a fumbled football. He grabbed the device, his trembling hands holding it up. He didn't know what it was, but row 7 man's reaction told him everything he needed. It mattered. And it mattered enough to terrify someone who feared nothing moments earlier. Benjamin's grip slipped. Sweat. Blood. Momentum. The attacker rammed an elbow into Benjamin's side, then his solar plexus. Benjamin's breath collapsed. Pain rippled through old injuries he hadn't felt in years. But before the attacker could break free, someone grabbed him from behind. Walter Pierce. The old man, frail on the outside, but forged from something harder, wrapped both arms around the attacker's waist, pulling him backward with everything left in his aging body. His face twisted in pain, but he didn't let go. "Get off my plane!" Walter growled through clenched teeth. The attacker snarled, slamming his head backward into Walter's brow. Eleanor shrieked. Walter wavered, but Benjamin surged forward, grabbing the man's arms, twisting, locking one elbow against the aisle wall. For a moment, the three of them were locked in a brutal, trembling triangle of force, youth age, and willpower straining against each other. The attacker wrenched free again, reaching under his hoodie for something small, square, metallic. A remote. Benjamin recognized it instantly, the captain's muffled struggles, the device rolling on the floor, The man in the cockpit fighting for control. Whatever the man held now was the partner tool. Benjamin didn't think. He lunged. His hand closed around the man's wrist. The attacker swung his elbow, connecting with Benjamin's jaw. Benjamin's teeth rattled, but he held on, twisting the wrist until the remote slipped from the attacker's fingers and skidded across the aisle. Eleanor kicked it. Hard. Her foot sent it flying under the opposite row, far out of reach. The attacker lunged after it, but Benjamin tackled him from behind. They crashed into the seats. The denim jacket man threw himself onto the attacker's legs. Another passenger pinned his arm. Row 7 man finally rushed forward, not to aid the attacker, but to restrain him, shouting, "Don't let him stand. Don't let him stand." Benjamin stared at him, furious. You knew. Row 7 man didn't meet his eyes. I didn't know he had help. This wasn't the deal. The cabin froze. Passengers gasped. Monica covered her mouth. David dropped into a seat, shaking. A deal. Benjamin spat. You brought this on board. Row 7 man swallowed, pale. I was supposed to monitor him, prevent violence, extract quietly after landing. I didn't know he had another operative. I didn't know he'd go for the cockpit. You didn't know Benjamin repeated the words cold and sharp. You didn't know because you weren't official. You weren't sanctioned. This was off book. Row 7 man didn't deny it. The attacker bucked under the weight of the passengers, shouting something in a language Benjamin didn't recognize. His rage filled the aisle like smoke, but he wasn't getting up. Not now. Not with 6 people on top of him. Then another sound. A single sickening thud from the cockpit. A sound that didn't belong on any flight. Benjamin turned toward the cracked open door. Silence followed. Thick. Dead. Wrong. Row 7 man looked toward the cockpit with sudden horror and whispered one sentence that drained the color from Benjamin's face. He wasn't supposed to kill the captain. A cold stillness swept through the cabin, so profound it felt like the engines themselves forgot to breathe. Benjamin stood frozen, Row 7 man's words echoing through him like an impact at the base of his spine. He wasn't supposed to kill the captain. Passengers gasped. Someone prayed under their breath. Monica's hands trembled against her lips. David staggered backward until his shoulders hit the galley door. Fear rippled through the aircraft in a single silent wave, the kind that changes the nature of a crisis from dangerous to catastrophic. Benjamin forced his thoughts into order, sharp, disciplined, merciless. If the captain was incapacitated, the first officer might be fighting alone. If both were overpowered, the cockpit was compromised. And if the aircraft was without a pilot, he wouldn't allow himself to finish that thought. Benjamin stepped toward Row 7 man, grabbing the front of his shirt. If the captain is dead, then who is flying this plane? Row 7 man's breath hitched. The first officer. If he's still conscious. And the man in there, Benjamin said through clenched teeth. What's his end game? Row 7 man swallowed. To force a diversion, land the aircraft somewhere off route. Intercept Pierce before authorities get involved. Walter stiffened at the mention of his name, his eyes sharp with old fear. Eleanor clung to him, whispering prayers, her cheeks streaked with tears she didn't realize had fallen. Benjamin tightened his grip. You said he wasn't supposed to kill anyone. If that's true, why did he go for the cockpit? He panicked, Row 7 man said, voice cracking with a helplessness that infuriated Benjamin. He thought Pierce was being protected. He thought backup was on the plane. He thought I'd been compromised. Benjamin shoved him backward. You think too much about what he thinks, and not nearly enough about the 100 souls on this aircraft. The attacker on the floor bucked violently, but passengers held him down with renewed force, fueled by terror. The denim jacket man gritted his teeth. He's not getting up. Not again. Benjamin nodded gratefully but kept his eyes on the cockpit. The cracked open door had gone completely still. No movement, no voices, no struggle. Just the faint glow of avionics illuminating the edge of the frame like twilight behind a horizon. Benjamin turned to Monica. "We need to know who is flying this plane." "I can't go in there," she whispered. "The door won't open unless the cockpit overrides." "Unless Benjamin said someone inside opens it." A long moment stretched. No one approached the door. Not the attacker pinned to the floor. Not row 7 man, who now looked like a cornered animal, realizing the cage he built was actually a trap. Not the passengers who stared, wide-eyed hearts, hammering minds, refusing to grasp the possibility that the people meant to protect them might already be gone. Benjamin stepped toward the cockpit himself. "Benjamin, no," Eleanor cried. "He has to," Walter whispered. Benjamin placed one hand on the cold metal, feeling the vibration of the engines through his palm. He didn't push yet. He simply listened. A breath, a scrape, anything. He pressed his ear to the door. Nothing. Silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's danger waiting to speak. Benjamin straightened, ready to try again, when a sudden impact slammed against the door from the inside. Hard enough to rattle the hinges. Hard enough to make Monica shout and jump backward. Hard enough for the entire cabin to gasp as one. Then came a voice, a strained, broken voice. "Help, I need!" A choking sound cut it off. Benjamin's blood iced. "That's the first officer," Monica whispered. "I know his voice." Benjamin didn't hesitate. Everyone moved back, but row 7 man lunged forward, grabbing Benjamin's arm. "You can't open that door. If the intruder gets full control." Benjamin spun, grabbing the man by the collar, with a brute strength fueled by fury and fear. "If the first officer dies, we lose the plane." The cabin erupted in alarmed whispers. Benjamin released him and turned to David. "Find the crash axe." David's eyes widened. "Benjamin breaking that door is illegal. So is letting a murderer fly this aircraft." David didn't argue again. He ran toward the rear galley. Benjamin faced Walter. "If that attacker gets control of the autopilot, we need to force access. Walter, you said you knew what they wanted from you. Why now?" Why tonight? Walter steadied himself against his cane. "I carried evidence, files, names, people who would lose everything if the truth came out. They never found all of it. Not after all these years." "What does this have to do with him?" Benjamin asked, nodding toward the subdued attacker. "They weren't sent to interrogate me," Walter said, trembling. "They were sent to erase the last person alive who knew what happened." Eleanor sobbed softly. Benjamin placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Row 7 man sank into a seat, head in his hands. Not guilt. Not remorse. Shock. He wasn't expecting this outcome. He wasn't prepared to handle it. David returned with the crash axe, red heavy, gleaming under the cabin lights. Benjamin gripped the handle. The weight felt like history settling into his palm. He walked toward the cockpit door, the aisle parting before him like a path carved by resolve. Passengers stared at him with a mixture of fear and hope. The attacker thrashed again, screaming in a language that filled the cabin with dread. Benjamin raised the axe. Monica placed a shaky hand on his wrist. "If you break that door, you only get one chance. Just one." Benjamin nodded. Behind him, Walter whispered a hoarse prayer. Row 7 man rose slowly defeated. If the intruder kills the first officer, he'll put the plane into a controlled descent. Benjamin looked him in the eye. Then I'd better reach him before that happens. He lifted the axe higher, and suddenly the cockpit door clicked, unlocked. The cabin froze, the latch slid open, and the door began to swing outward as if someone inside wanted Benjamin to enter. But not just Benjamin. Someone was crawling toward the opening, dragging themselves with one arm, blood streaking the floor behind them. The first officer, barely conscious, eyes wide with terror. He reached for Benjamin's leg and whispered 4 shaking words. He's not alone in there. The first officer's whisper hung in the air like a drop of ink spreading through water, slow, dark, irreversible. Not alone. Those words detonated inside Benjamin's mind, unleashing a chain reaction of danger he could almost feel vibrating through the cabin floor. Monica cried out and knelt beside the first officer, pressing her hands against the wound at his side. Blood pooled warm and dark between her fingers. The man's breathing rattled thin and broken, but his eyes, sharp with terror, never left the cockpit behind him. He lifted one trembling hand toward the interior, toward something unseen, something waiting. Benjamin stepped forward, but the first officer's grip clamped around his ankle with shocking strength. "No," he rasped. "He's not the only one." And then, with a sudden surge of adrenaline-fueled panic, the first officer pushed himself up and slammed the cockpit door shut with the side of his shoulder. The metal reverberated with a sickening clang. He sagged to the floor again, gasping. Benjamin grabbed his shoulders. "Who else is in there? Who is he talking to?" The first officer shook his head weakly. Didn't see him. Just heard him. A second voice telling him about the autopilot. A cold current ripped through Benjamin's spine. A coordinated attack. 2 infiltrators, one disabling the crew and the second giving instructions. Walter staggered, nearly losing his grip on his cane. "Benjamin, they're going to take the plane." Row 7 man swore under his breath something sharp and bitter. "I told them he'd never cooperate. I told them he wasn't useful anymore." Benjamin rounded on him. "This is your doing. Your group brought this threat on board." Row 7 man's jaw tightened. "My job was to retrieve Pierce without causing a scene. These men," he gestured violently toward the pinned attacker, "were supposed to remove him quietly. No one was supposed to die." Benjamin stepped into his space voice, low, lethal. "You don't get to rewrite your intentions now." The cabin lurched again, harder this time. Overhead, bins rattled. A mother screamed. The lights dimmed, then steadied. Someone vomited. Panic snowballed through the rows like wildfire fear, contagious enough to spread faster than reason. David grabbed the interphone again, dialing the emergency code for the cockpit. No answer. Benjamin turned toward the door. If someone else was inside, if they'd managed to disable one pilot and restrain the other, then time was evaporating by the second. Not minutes. Seconds. He lifted the crash axe again. Walter called out behind him. "Benjamin, wait." Benjamin faced him. Walter stood tall despite the shaking in his limbs, despite the fear hollowing his cheeks. Eleanor gripped his arm tightly, pleading with her eyes. Walter met Benjamin's stare and whispered the truth Benjamin already suspected. "They don't want the plane," Walter said. "They want the black box. They want access to the flight recorder." Benjamin blinked, why Walter swallowed hard. "Because I'm the one who hid the evidence in the first place." The cabin went silent. Row 7 man jerked his head toward Walter, stunned. "That file still exists. They swore you destroyed it." Walter shook his head. "I hid it in a flight data package. A backup set was encoded into a recorder 20 years ago. The only physical system that stored it was retired and kept in an archive accessible through airborne authorization protocols. Benjamin felt his stomach tighten. "You mean," he said slowly, "the evidence they wanted from you all these years is inside aviation records?" Walter's voice trembled. "Buried, lost, untraceable, unless someone knew which flight log to request. But now someone found out." Monica covered her mouth. David stared in disbelief. Passengers leaned forward, desperate for clarity, even as fear gnawed at their composure. Row 7 man exhaled shakily. "He's not trying to crash the plane. He's trying to rewrite the flight recorder, erase the only proof left." Benjamin's grip on the crash axe tightened, and he's using the cockpit to override the secure data link, Benjamin said, which means the aircraft dipped sharply. People screamed. A drink cart rolled out of the galley, slamming into a row of seats. Oxygen masks jostled in their compartments. The engines roared louder as pitch and altitude fluctuated. Benjamin felt himself thrown sideways, catching the headrest to stay upright. Then a second voice echoed from behind the cockpit door. Calm, controlled. "You have 10 minutes to unlock this system." It wasn't the attacker's voice. It wasn't the captain's. It was someone else. Someone who belonged in neither uniform nor passenger manifest. Benjamin pressed his ear to the metal. "Who are you?" the voice answered, as if expecting the question. "I'm the one trying to prevent a national scandal." Benjamin felt his breath slow. Everything sharpened into clinical clarity. Walter's evidence. An off-book operation. A black box holding a secret buried for decades. A government faction trying to erase history before it resurfaced. This wasn't an attack. It was a cover-up. Benjamin lowered the axe, thinking fast. "Walter, what exactly is on that recorder?" Walter closed his eyes, as if confessing something heavy enough to fracture him. Proof of a covert operation gone wrong. Proof that innocent people died because of orders carried out in the shadows. Proof that high-ranking officials lied. And proof that I was the only one who refused to sign off on the report. Eleanor squeezed his hand, tears running silently. Benjamin nodded once, then turned toward the cockpit. "I'm going in." Monica grabbed his sleeve. "No, Benjamin, you don't know what's inside. I don't need to know," he said softly. "I only need to know what's at stake." Row 7 man rose hesitantly, pain and conflict carved across his face. "I'll go with you. I didn't sign up for this." Benjamin stared at him. "Can I trust you?" Row 7 man hesitated. "Then, if that black box is altered, people will die to keep the secret buried, including us." Benjamin lifted the axe again. The first officer tried to speak, but collapsed into unconsciousness. Benjamin stepped toward the cockpit door, Row 7 man beside him. The lights flickered, the aircraft trembled, and the calm, controlled voice inside the cockpit delivered one final warning. 5 minutes, gentlemen. After that, the flight log erases permanently. Benjamin inhaled, feeling the weight of Walter's secret, the lives on this plane, the truth straining against the darkness that had caged it for 20 years. He tightened his grip and prepared to force the door open. The cockpit door buckled inward as Benjamin and the former operative slammed their combined weight against it. The crash axe wedged like a steel wedge at the hinge. The metal groaned, resisting, then finally gave way with a shuddering crack that sent both men stumbling into the narrow flight deck. What greeted them wasn't chaos, but a chilling stillness. The captain lay slumped against the side wall, unconscious, but breathing. The first officer, barely alive, had dragged himself toward the door moments earlier, and at the center of the cockpit, sat the intruder strapped into the captain's seat, headset on one hand, resting over the control pedestal, the other hovering near the input panel that controlled the data recorder override. He turned slowly, calm as stone. "You've wasted time you don't have." Benjamin stepped forward, eyes locked on the man's fingers, noticing the faint tremor of urgency beneath the surface of his composure. The operative beside Benjamin circled warily, sweat beading at his temple. Every monitor glowed with warning messages, altitude shifts, and blinking notices of unauthorized access. The plane was still stable, but only barely riding on the first officer's last commands. "You can't complete the overwrite," the operative snapped. "You don't have the full clearance string." "I don't need it," the intruder replied softly. "I have the fallback sequence. 3 minutes." Benjamin lunged for him, but the intruder hit a switch that sent the plane into a sharp pitch change, throwing Benjamin backward into the center console. The world tilted alarms, shrieking. The operative grabbed the overhead panel to anchor himself. The intruder used the momentary disorientation to type a series of rapid commands into the data link terminal. A progress bar appeared crawling forward in small, pulsing increments. Data overwrite 5%. Benjamin pushed himself upright, tasting blood in the back of his throat. The intruder's foot braced against the rudder pedals, keeping the plane in a slight bank. He didn't need to crash the aircraft. He only needed to buy time. Benjamin grabbed the armrest of the captain's seat, ripping the intruder sideways. They struggled in the cramped space elbows, slamming against the panel knees, smashing into metal rails. The operative wrestled for the man's wrist, trying to pry it from the keyboard. A knee strike caught Benjamin under the ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. Data overwrite 20%. The intruder reached for the transmit key, sweat streaking down his face. "When this is done," he gasped, "no one will ever know what happened. Not the public. Not the courts. Not even Pierce." Benjamin slammed his forearm into the man's jaw, dazing him long enough for the operative to yank him from the chair. The intruder lashed out with a desperate kick, sending the operative crashing into the forward panel. Buttons depressed. A klaxon sounded. Data overwrite 35%. Benjamin saw one chance. He grabbed the headset cord, wrapping it around the intruder's forearm, using it like a tether to wrench him backward. The intruder collapsed to the floor with a cry. The operative dove for the keyboard, trying to cancel the sequence, but the panel flashed red. Override locked. Two-factor confirmation complete. Data overwrite 50%. The intruder grinned through bleeding teeth. "It's too late," he rasped. "Once it hits 75%, the log becomes unrecoverable." Benjamin didn't stop. He pinned the man with his knee, grabbing the crash axe from the floor. With a single decisive motion, he slammed the flat of the axe head into the terminal's power junction. Sparks burst across the cockpit. The monitor flickered, then blacked out with a hiss. Silence flooded the space. Then a soft hum as backup systems rerouted inputs. The progress bar froze at 52%. The intruder stared at the dead terminal, horror unraveling his confidence. No, you idiot. You shut down live data. The system will quarantine the overwrite file. You don't know what damage you've done." Benjamin dropped the axe chest, heaving sweat dripping into his eyes. "I know I stopped you." The operative cuffed the intruder with a zip tie, torn from an emergency kit. Once secured, he slid into the first officer's seat hands, moving across the controls with surprising familiarity. "I can fly us the rest of the way," he muttered. "I was certified once." Benjamin glanced at him. "Once I didn't always work off the books." He engaged autopilot stabilization. the plane leveled with a smoothness that spread collective relief through the cabin behind them. Benjamin dragged a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the moment settling across his shoulders. The secret in the recorder survived. Not intact, not safe, but alive. Like Walter, like Eleanor, like the truth. Behind him, the first officer groaned, beginning to stir. Sirens chirped their final warnings as the plane steadied on course again. Passengers unaware of the exact details erupted into applause the moment Benjamin stepped back into the aisle. Some reached for his hand. Some whispered, "Thank you." Others simply exhaled the breath they'd been holding for 30 minutes that felt like a lifetime. Benjamin walked to Walter's row. The older man rose slowly, meeting him with eyes full of decades of fear, gratitude, and something else resolve. "It's not buried anymore," Walter whispered. "No," Benjamin said. "And it won't ever be again." He looked down the aisle to the trembling crew, the shaken passengers, the life returning to every face as the plane stabilized. Something had shifted in the world tonight. Not just truth resurfacing, but the way ordinary people rose into extraordinary edges of themselves when tested. As the aircraft descended toward Boston, the city lights rising to meet them like a field of stars. Benjamin felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter. Purpose. And if you believe stories like this deserve a place in the world, don't forget to subscribe, and comment 3 words in English: stand for truth.